Well, welcome everybody. We're here with Senator Julian Cyr, who represents the Cape and Islands District. And we're happy to have him with us to talk about some of the recent developments up at the legislature. I know you're just about finishing up your session. Tell us how it went overall. You feel good about how things are going? And
Sure. So thank you, Bill, for having me, and to MashpeeTV. Always good to be with you. So we're in the tail end of the legislative session. In the day we're recording this, we've got 5 days to go to July 31st, which is the traditional deadline by which the House and the Senate have to reconcile legislation. We've been very busy. We'll be even busier in these intervening days. A whole host of important things on the docket. We'll do an economic development bill. We're likely going to reconcile some really urgent, important healthcare issues. Likely we'll get resolution on a bunch of other matters. I've been working on some healthcare bills that will hopefully get done. The big thing that is outstanding that we're not going to do by July 31st is to pass the final budget for fiscal year 21. So that's the fiscal year that passed that started July 1st. And the real challenge here for us is we're really struggling to figure out what the fiscal picture is going to be, because of COVID-19, because of the recession that we're in. And a lot of this actually hinges on what action does Congress and the federal government take. So in one scenario, if Congress passed and it was signed into law, what the House of Representatives passed maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago, Massachusetts would get up to $10 billion, which would likely cover us through this fiscal year and next fiscal year. What's being talked about in the U.S. Senate, which is much more narrow, is about would probably result in around $2 or $3 billion coming to the state. Still a significant amount of money. We estimate that the fiscal gap, the revenue gap for the current fiscal year we're in now, is about $5 billion. So for context, and we're talking a lot of big numbers here, right? For context, that's about double the revenue gap we saw during the Great Recession years. So, we're looking at something that's sort of twice as bad. But I think my hope is, I think actually we may be able to get out of this a little better than we thought, at least right now for this fiscal year, with some federal stimulus. What I'm actually really worried about is the next fiscal year 22, which will start next year. But certainly I think there'll be a lot of pain there. We'll probably have exhausted, our rainy day fund and other resources to kind of keep us afloat. So that's sort of the big piece that's outstanding. And we'll likely come back either later in August or in September to pass that final budget. Again, wanting to have sort of the most up-to-date information possible for us to make some really tough decisions, honestly. This is when you're in a recession like this, when you're in a pandemic, these are not easy decisions. There's a lot of pain, unfortunately, to go around. But I think I am optimistic and hopeful. Maybe we'll see something come out of Washington, and that'll really determine what we're able to do in Massachusetts.
yeah, I should mention today is July 28th, I think. It's hard to keep track of this. Right?
I think it's the 27th, but either way.
27th. All right, yeah, it's only Monday still, but and one of the hottest days of the year, we'll note.
Yes.
But I think one of the big things that's been catching my attention lately is this whole debate on police reform, and I know
Yes.
it's been tossing around a lot of things in the Senate and the House. Can you tell us what is this reform bill going to do, and why you support it, and why?
So, thank you, Bill. And I'd say we've really been trying in the legislature, and especially in the Massachusetts Senate, to really meet the moment of the Black Lives Matter movement. We now know that the Black Lives Matter movement is arguably the largest social movement for change we've seen in this country. Over 26 million Americans protested across the country after the murder of George Floyd. And that's right here on Cape Cod. Certainly in Mashpee at the Rotary. I participated in protests in Harwich and Orleans and Hyannis and Provincetown. Never seen anything like it. And so I think we're really trying to, do the really hard work of addressing structural racism in our communities, in our state. And when I say structural, because it's not actually about individuals, right? It's about larger organizations, institutions, cultures that, you and I and all of us are a part of. And so that started around police reform. And so the Senate earlier this month, and now the House has both taken action on a pretty sweeping set of police reform proposals. Most of what's in both bills is actually stuff that's not too controversial. A lot of this is around the idea of police officer certification, which is an idea, honestly, that police chiefs have been asking for about a decade. There's a number of restrictions on use of deadly force. I'm really trying to rein in and sort of prevent, these instances where you really have excessive uses of force. We put limitations on facial recognition. We make a whole host of reforms to the state police, which is an organization that's had, unfortunately, some corruption and needs some sunlight in. And there's a number of other kind of pieces in there. This, just because sort of the bulk of the bill is not controversial doesn't mean that there's some pretty much more kind of hot button controversial topics that are in it. Most of the debate has, at least on the Senate side, centered around this concept that's called qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is a protection that's established through case law, so the courts, that individuals who are working for the public, right, public employees, whether you work for the town or the state, so a police officer, or if you're a teacher or a firefighter, or you're someone who works in my office, you're typically covered from liability through this concept that's called qualified immunity. Well, qualified immunity, as it's been interpreted in the courts, the pendulum on qualified immunity has just swung way too far. And so what we aim to do, and what we did in the final bill that passed the Senate, and I should say it passed the Senate 30-7, so it passed by a supermajority, is we just move that pendulum back a little bit in the middle as it relates to qualified immunity. So qualified immunity provisions still apply if you're a police officer or any other public official or person who's working in the public interest, or for the public, I should say. But what we do say is, look, if you violate someone's civil or constitutional rights in a knowing manner, right, in the way that we saw with that officer, for 8 minutes and 41 seconds, in killing George Floyd, right, you are not going to get qualified immunity. And so that's what we did. There was a lot of kind of debate and unfortunately some sort of misunderstanding about what we were talking about. This is a pretty complicated part of jurisprudence and part of law. But I think that the resounding vote that we had on this as a supermajority in the final bill, I think really speaks to the fact that, as lawmakers, those of us who really sunk our teeth into this issue, we understand it. This certainly is not going to change anything about how public employees, including police officers, are subject to financial liability. So what's called indemnity, basically meaning that if you are found to have violated, or if you're found liable, your employer, the municipality or the state or the other sort of public agency, they're the one who's sort of the payer here. So no one with this change, if it's enacted into law, no one's going to lose a house over this or anything like that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation about what the debate was. But I think broadly, and folks can kind of disagree about, whether this is a good tact or not. I really think that, we're doing some good stuff here. I think that we are meeting the moment of what a lot of police and good police departments are doing anyway. Certainly there's been a whole host of concern about this in the debate. So I'd encourage anyone with further questions, visit senatorcyr.com /police reform, and we've got a whole explanation up there that'll explain it. But I think broadly, I'm proud that as a Senate, we really met the moment here and are working on strong change. The House just passed their version of the bill this past Friday. We're now going to reconcile that in a conference committee. I also want to say, though, if this is the only thing we do to address structural racism and to meet the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to be missing it, right? There's so much work that needs to be done, across our society, across the institutions and organizations, and with the law that's broader than policing. And so I want to be clear that this is the first step, but certainly not the last thing that we need to do in the legislature to really meet the moment here.
Nice. Sounds great. Back to the pandemic. I mean, everybody's almost tired of hearing it, talking about it, but recently, as you know, Chatham had a little cluster, if you will. What is your view of the current state as far as Cape Cod and then the state as a whole?
So I think broadly, Massachusetts and Cape Cod in particular has done well since we came out of the surge that we had in April and early May. And that I think is good news. I think it's really thanks to people taking personal responsibility, people being vigilant, following these common health protocols that we all have learned, right? Covering your nose and mouth when you're in public, keeping your distance, washing your hands frequently, staying home if you're sick. And we just got to keep that up. We need to continue to be vigilant. Really want to remind people that smaller gatherings are much less likely to spread COVID than larger gatherings. Being outdoors, it's much harder to spread COVID-19 if you're outdoors than if you're indoors. Really encourage people to take it outside. What we're seeing with the health data right now is we're seeing a slight trend of increasing cases. I'm unclear if this is sort of a trend or it sort of goes back or do we see a spike? Certainly what happened in Chatham with this house party is not good. And if we sort of keep seeing things like this, it's likely we'll likely then see in the cases potentially good reason to sort of be even more vigilant, to kind of retreat a little bit on our reopening. We're just following this very, very closely. To be clear, I'm not sort of making the rules of the road here when it comes to reopening. That's up to the governor and his administration. But what we've been doing with this Cape Cod reopening task force is just make sure we're speaking with one voice as a region. Our visitors, our seasonal residents, even those of us who live here year round, they don't necessarily see the sort of parochial boundaries between, say, Mashpee and Yarmouth or Truro and Eastham. And so we're really trying to speak with one voice here so the public knows what they need to do to keep themselves safe and keep their families and everyone else safe. But we've done a pretty good job, but we need to be very vigilant. And I do worry about what likely is to come. If not in the coming weeks, then certainly into the fall and winter when flu season and COVID-19 collide. That's going to be very difficult, I fear.
For sure, right. And yeah, I guess you can't say it enough that parties, wherever people are going, they have to be smart about covering.
Yeah, and we know exactly. Take it out, and also take it outside, right? Like the more we know about COVID, the more difficult it is. We know it's difficult to transmit COVID outdoors, especially if there's wind and there's sunlight, and we've got plenty of that here on Cape Cod. So really urging people, take it outside. Follow these common sense guidelines. That'll make a really big difference for us. And we'll really determine, do we continue on the path that we've been on, which has been broadly a real success story here in Massachusetts, despite, a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, or do we have to sort of retreat and have to be even more vigilant? And that's really going to be up to all of us to see what we do, right? It's on us.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is there anything that you've done specifically for the region as far as COVID? Maybe bringing in some monies or
sure. We've been doing a lot. We've been doing a lot as it relates to COVID. I can't even keep track of all the things. Looking at resources for testing. So in a recent supplemental budget, the delegation worked collaboratively. So this is with Dave Vieira and myself, Sue Moran, who's the new state senator for the Upper Cape and Plymouth, Dylan Fernandez. We secured $550,000 to expand testing capacity here in Barnstable County. And then I've been spending a lot of time working to shore up the Steamship Authority. The Steamship Authority actually is, from a financial perspective, has always been a quite well-run organization, at least when it comes to their finances. So the Steamship Authority, since it was created in the 1960s, has never received a dime from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's actually one of only 2 transit entities in the country that rely on their fare box and are self-sustaining from their fare box. But what happened with COVID-19, particularly in March, April, and May, is their ridership plummeted, and therefore their revenue plummeted. So I was able to work again with the whole delegation, particularly in partnership with Dylan Fernandez, who represents the islands with me in the House, to basically make sure that if the steamship authority has a budget gap at the end of the year, then the state's going to pay the bill. That port communities are not going to be on the hook for really this unforeseen budget gap. The steamship authority has been doing better with ridership, right? We're much busier this summer than we were in the spring, but this is a real important provision that's going to hold harmless port communities, so our communities won't be on the hook in the event that the steamship authority runs a deficit at the end of their fiscal year, which ends at the end of 2020.
So speaking of the testing capacity, is there any concern that we should have? I mean, I personally have never been tested. I'm kind of curious, I guess. I've been healthy through the whole thing as far as I can tell. But yeah, I don't know. Is there people, I mean, what is the testing capacity? And if we do see a spike over the next few weeks, do you know
So,
what's...
yeah. As someone who has been tested, and actually I was tested for COVID-19 antibodies, and I'm positive for COVID-19 antibodies. So I had COVID-19. Actually, I know when I had it was in mid-March. I fortunately was already quarantining at the time. It doesn't appear that I made any constituents or my family sick. So I feel very sort of fortunate there. We've worked really hard to build up our testing capacity here. And we actually have quite a bit of capacity for testing, whether it be through labs, through Cape Cod Healthcare, some good work that EMS and Fire have done in partnership with Barnstable County. The issue we're running into right now is turnaround time of tests, especially blood draws that are going to laboratories. It can take 4, 5, 6, 8 days to get the results back. That's not ideal. We're running into supply chain issues. So we've got the staff and we've got the machinery, the equipment to run these tests, but we don't have the kits or the supplies to make them happen. That's been a big issue. So we're in sort of good shape. We've done sort of everything we can do to make testing more widely available, but the problem is around turnaround time and is around supply chain. And those are pieces that we're actively working. Where I'd like to get is that we have on-demand testing, right? If you are someone who wants a test and needs a test, you can get a test. And you shouldn't have to worry about paying for that test. You shouldn't worry about, any of those kind of details. It should be on-demand testing. That's where we need to get to if we're going to be able to ride this out for the duration we need to ride this out, essentially until we have a vaccine. So that's the goal. We're not there yet, but that's what I'm shooting for.
Yeah. Well, let's shifting gears a little. You mentioned the Steamship Authority and how well they've done, and I don't know if that plays into the transportation bond bill that recently was passed, but tell us about that bond bill with transportation.
Sure. So we took up a pretty significant investment in our transportation infrastructure, both in the House and in the Senate. But the piece that we really prioritized here on Cape Cod was around funding for the Cape Cod Canal bridges, for the Bourne and Sagamore bridges. Those have been recommended for replacement by the Army Corps of Engineers. An agreement has been reached actually between the Army Corps and the Mass Department of Transportation that once these new bridges are built, the state's going to assume ownership and have sort of more control over these bridges. So we were able to secure in the bill that we took up $350 million, and this is for road, exit, rotary construction enhancements. I want to give a big shout out to my friend and colleague Sue Moran, who was just elected this spring to serve in the Senate. She represents Falmouth, Bourne, Sandwich, and Plymouth, and a few other towns off Cape. So she filed the amendment. I was the co-sponsor on the amendment. Being able to get $350 million is no small feat. And so really want to give a big shout out to Sue for getting that done. So I think, there's a lot of, we have a lot to get through, but I think that it's really promising that the canal replacement projects for these bridges are well underway. And I think we could see new bridges, sometime in the middle of this decade, which is faster than I expected, for sure.
Definitely. One final thing, and I know it's hard to talk about this because nobody really knows, but Mashpee High School just had their graduation. It was done outside in tents. Everybody was properly spaced, and it really went off well. And kudos to Patty DeVore and the rest of the staff over there. But is there anything you could say about the schools opening, not opening? I mean, I've heard a statistic recently where at least 80% of parents don't want it to open in the fall as scheduled.
So schools, are going to be sort of the biggest challenge we're going to be facing in the coming weeks as Labor Day approaches. And this is something that the Cape Cod Reopening Task Force has been looking at and talking about, trying to figure out for quite some time. And we actually started with childcare because early education and childcare became such an acute issue as people were working from home or essential workers having to go into work and with no childcare options. When childcare options came back online in June, of the 263 early education providers on Cape Cod, only 19 of them opened by the end of June. That is a huge, huge concern. And so now school is really part of that. I should also add, summer camps and other, all sorts of, educational opportunities for young people. Yes, we're investing in their future, and there's nothing more important than that. But we're also providing a means of childcare, which is really important for our economy. So there's sort of no sort of easy answers here right now. The Mashpee schools and all the school districts across the state have to come up with essentially a version of 3 plans, right? One plan where you'd be in school, one plan where you have remote learning, and then a third where there's sort of a mixed model. This is going to be really tough. I also think whether or not we're able to return to school is going to be determined by what happens with cases. What sort of trends do we see here in Massachusetts? Does the slight increase we've been seeing, does that continue? Do we see a decrease in cases? Do we see a spike? I think that'll really sort of determine what actually happens with schools. But it's tremendously challenging, and I think it's given everyone, particularly in our business community, a renewed appreciation for what schools and early education and the entire education sector does. I think we've this is going to be tough, and so it'll continue to have my full attention. But want to be honest that it's a difficult one.
For sure. We're running short on time. Thank you much for joining us, and I hope we could do this again sometime soon. How
Bill,
can
always glad to do it.
Yeah. In the process, is there any way for people to get in on the task force somehow, send ideas or thoughts or whatever?
Sure. So if you visit reopeningcapecod.org, that's the whole website of the task force. You'll see the members. There's a comment feature, a whole host of information. Any kind of whether you're a business owner or a worker or a prospective visitor. Or someone just who's trying to figure out information, check out reopeningcapecod.org. And then if you have a more specific issue, reach out directly to my office. You can either call me, the office number is 617-722-1570, or email me at julian.cyr@masenate.gov. We've been helping a lot of folks, and we're going to continue to do that for the duration of this pandemic. This is a really trying time, but I see a lot of Cape Codders meeting the moment, making things happen, helping out neighbors, and so that's what we're just aiming to do.
Well, Senator, thanks for joining us today, and I hope we can do it again soon.
You bet. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Bill.